Freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of speech, freedom of worship. 75 years after their debut, Norman Rockwell's series of illustrations known as the Four Freedoms is getting another turn in the spotlight. Beginning on July 7th, with a reunion of former models who posed for some of Rockwell's paintings over the course of the 14 years he lived in Arlington, between 1939 and 1953, a series of events is planned to celebrate Rockwell's life and work. They center around the Four Freedoms series Rockwell painted, and which were subsequently published as covers of the then widely circulated magazine Saturday Evening Post, as part of a war bond fundraising drive. Dr. Joshua Sherman, the lead organizer of the Four Freedoms Festival, takes it from there.
Norman Rockwell heard FDR's address where he outlined four essential human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom of worship. And Rockwell felt that the words were too highfalutin, I believe was his quote, for most people to really understand. So he really wanted to capture the essence of the Four Freedoms. And it was one night he was at an Arlington town hall meeting, and a neighbor of his, Jim Edgerton, stood up. He was a farmer, and he spoke against the tide. And he didn't win the argument, but Norman Rockwell had this epiphany, this moment where he said, wait, that's freedom of speech. And he decided to once again use his Arlington neighbors as his models and capture the essence of these four freedoms. He went down to Washington to volunteer his services, and I often compare this to Brad Pitt with Hurricane Katrina, that he really lent his celebrity, and as a result there was a huge influx of cash supporting that cause. But what happened with Rockwell was that in 1942, when he went down to Washington, the folks at the War Department said, well, you know, in the last war we used illustrators like you, this war we want real artists. And it was a huge slap in the face. But the punchline to the story is that he ended up having his work published in the Saturday Evening Post, and long before the term was used, those images essentially went viral. Requests to reprint flooded in from all over the world, and it was then the Treasury Department. By 1943, the Allies were now in the war. The U.S. had joined the Allies in the war, and Rockwell went ahead and was asked by the Treasury Department to tour the country with the original Four Freedoms paintings. Those paintings, that tour raised $133 million, which is the equivalent of almost $2 billion today. And it's a remarkable piece of American history because it's one of those moments where art really does make a difference. And it all started because of a single voice in a town hall meeting.
The festival starts on July 7th with a models reunion at the Arlington Memorial High School from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. An exhibit of the artwork made by Rockwell and some of the other artists who lived in Arlington during the 20th century will also run concurrently through the festival at the Martha Canfield Library from June 30th to August 18th. Don Trekte Jr. was helping set up the exhibit at the library and gave us the overview.
This was a period in Arlington from 1939 to 1954 that these artists contributed more than 275 Saturday Evening Post covers and inside illustrations. And it's just a neat story. We have Gene Pelham over here. Gene contributed 2 Saturday Evening Post covers during his early period. And actually he modeled for the second cover here. And he was an extraordinary artist himself, but he became the photographer for Norman Rockwell. So he spent most of his time doing his individual art, plus he did work for Norman Rockwell. George Hughes arrived in early, about 1941, 42, and again, his trade began in New York City, and he contributed an extraordinary number of Saturday Evening Post covers. And I think over 135 altogether, while he was in Arlington, more than 55 during that same period. Now over here is Meade Schaefer, a very close friend of Norman Rockwell. And actually it was Meade Schaefer and Norman who kind of came up to Arlington about the same time in 1939. And it was in the summer of 1939 that Meade said to Norman, his good friend, he said, I think I'm just going to stay here forever. I'm just not going to leave Arlington. And Norman looked at him and said, I think I'll stay in Arlington too. And so they never went back to New Rochelle, New York. And so it's a funny story. They really worked well together in that Norman always needed a critic to come in and determine, if the image is right or not. But it was Mead who was this fabulous illustrator and so quick with his artwork.
On Wednesday, July 11th, an event at the Bennington Museum will highlight freedom from want by focusing on so-called victory gardens from World War II and the modern-day farm-to-table movement. On Friday, July 13th, will come an exhibit, also at the Bennington Museum, on challenges for freedom. Then on Wednesday, July 18th, at the Manchester Community Library, a presentation on storytelling will celebrate Rockwell's work. And still more events are planned for July 20th, the 21st, and the 22nd to highlight freedom of speech, religion, and freedom from fear, to be held in Arlington and Manchester. But the centerpiece of it all may be a musical titled Perfect Picture, where a Broadway cast and production team will bring the Rockwell story to the Arkell Pavilion at the Southern Vermont Arts Center on July 20th and 21st, with performances scheduled for 3 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. Dr. Sherman gives us the background.
And my mom, Eileen Bluestone Sherman, was inspired by that notion that Norman Rockwell really captured this moment in American history by looking around him and capturing and using his neighbors as his models. The way that this all started in terms of the Four Freedoms Festival is that the musical is really about Rockwell's quest to create the Four Freedoms Suite. He was very different than the pictures he painted. He was a true artist and driven to create a masterpiece. And his family life was very different than the pictures he painted. And the juxtaposition of the real life story of Norman Rockwell's quest to create the Four Freedoms and his real life makes for a very dramatic musical piece.
The Four Freedoms Festival has already generated some big-time buzz when it made the shortlist of 15 summer favorite events published by the New York Times. An essay contest on the Four Freedoms has also been held at the Arlington Memorial High School as part of the overall festival. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.